So we're going to continue with the slides that we started with last week. Can anyone remind us of what we covered last week? What did we get started on last week? Was anyone here last week? So if you were here, you'd be able to tell me something of what you learned last week. We talked about stereotypes in the African continent. What else? Good. So, what did we say about who is an African? What else? Was anyone else here last week?
We talked about American Africans in history and history and period. And we talked about
That's why some people say when they say history, what they're saying is that's his story. It's not our story. Right? And that's, of course, intentional about being the point. Very good. What else? Like what? What's up? Africanity. Yeah, what's about it? That we can talk about levels of Africanness. And what examples did we give of that? Our parents, okay. Cool, good. Anything else before we continue? So we talked about Kemet, but Kemet wasn't the only civilization that we had. We mentioned Great Zimbabwe, which has these huge stone structures. We mentioned Meroe. There's Kush. There are so many African civilizations that predate any civilization anywhere in Eurasia. But again, we don't learn about those because it's not us to set our curriculum to start off with during colonialism. They say we'll only start counting from when they came into history. That's the Eurasians. So the misrepresentations will continue. The idea that Africa has no history. I think we debunked that thoroughly last class. The idea that Africans have no civilization, although we were the ones who invented civilization. The idea that Africa is a dark continent. Now this is ironic because we get more sunlight than anyone. Right? And the paradox is the more light you get, the blacker you are. The less light you get, the lighter you are. And we're talking about in terms of complexion. So if you look all throughout the equator, you find that the people who live on the equator tend to be very dark, right? Whereas those who, such as Europeans, they went through what was called the Worm glaciation. I think we mentioned that last time. WURM glaciation. So this was a period where the ice caps came down and then covered much of what is now we know as Europe. So they had to live through this period where there was oftentimes very little to no sunshine due to cloud cover. So all of these had an impact on what their external appearance looks like, right? So that's another one. The idea that Africans have inferior minds. What did we discuss last time dealing with that? Does anyone think that that is so? Not sure, man. Does anyone think that Africans have inferior minds? You do? Good. Why is that?
So the thing is, I believe Africans are refusing to think, and we refuse to think, because if you look at what the Europeans are doing, and compare to what we are doing, they are doing much, and then the African man feels that he or she can't do the same thing as they are doing, but then it's false.
So yeah, so that's false. Now, at African Studies, if you go upstairs, and I think everyone should go upstairs, you'll see an entire poster that has various inventions that were made by African people, right? Now, is anyone aware that the PC, as a personal computer, was invented by an African? No. Do you think if you knew that, you wouldn't think that African people had inferior minds? Right? So we mentioned things in ancient past that we don't know about. What about things in modern times that we still don't know about? From the PC, this is Dr. Mark Dean, and we'll actually come during this class to significant inventions. Even what you know as the .com, this is the internet. This is due to Network Solutions, another African named Emmett McHenry. Right? Yes.
Was all this discovered in Africa, invented in Africa, or they were blacks living there?
You have both. And we'll actually show you a chart that shows things that were invented by Africans living here and Africans living there. But remember, regardless of location, they do not turn into biscuits because they are living somewhere else, right? So we'll come back to this point, especially when we get to the inventions, because we mentioned all the things we invented, such as language, such as writing, such as spirituality. We can go on and on, such as mathematics, such as science, such as medicine. The oldest text on medicine, and you have several, they call it the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus. You have the Kahun. And they named this after Edwin Smith, who was the one who stole it. But this was authored by who? Imhotep. And this is the practice that they always name the text after the places that they stole them and took them to. So called the Moscow Papyrus, or the Paris Papyrus, or the London Papyrus. It was not written in any of those places. It was written right here in Kemet, land of the blacks, right? And then they also named it after the ones who stole it and took it there, right? So you can look this one up, you can look this one up. And what we're talking about is the first discovery of the pulse, the human pulse, right? And understanding that the heart is linked to all of the different limbs. This is what you found written. There's a good book called African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period, and that's by Theophile Obenga. Who is a linguist and a master of many languages, including African languages and European languages as well. So this is Theophile Obenga. And then there's also so this is an African from Central Africa. This is an African living in the U.S. Now, this one is, I would say, better for as an introductory text of someone who has no background in understanding of ancient African history. They can start with this one. This one, you could also start with this one, but it's a little bit more advanced. So he goes into the language, he goes into the text. He translates text, each one that shows the origin of mathematics. He'll give you the original text as it appears, he'll translate it for you. They'll give you the commentary of the significance. He'll go into the origin of science. He'll go into the origin of clothing, various types of linen. All these things that African people invented, and he's giving you the source, original text that your African ancestors wrote down so that you would never think that you have what? Inferior minds. Your ancestors were preserving it for you, but now when you look at it, you say, look at the pretty pictures. You understand? So this is one of the things that we're trying to deal with. And then also we have to deal with how come we don't know this information. So I was talking about Emmett McHenry before we went back into ancient times. So he had network solutions, and this is what we now know as the internet. This was the original registrar for the internet. So if you ever see anything called .com, it's because of an African person. We can go on, and we'll come into some of the more recent things, the traffic lights, the gas masks, right? These are things, you know, in the US you have Black History Month, so as a child you will grow up knowing these things. Unfortunately here, they wiped out history, so you don't learn anything about history. And the few things that you do learn, I'm talking about somewhere else. And then this is the result we get. We say we don't like our society, we don't like corruption, this is like a science experiment. What happens when you don't know anything about yourself? This is the end result, right? So if we don't like the end result, then we have to give a different input to the science experiment. Now let's see, we don't like that, now let's do a different experiment. What happens when you do know about yourself? And also know about who your enemies have been throughout history? I'm sure you would get a different result, right? But we'll continue. Also different ideas about Africa. Africa is presented in one of two ways, generally. So the idea of accept Africa, the idea that development works everywhere in the world but in Africa. Therefore Africa has to change rather than development policies tailor themselves better to the needs of Africa. So they'll say you have to do your economics just like we are doing in London. You have to do it just like we're doing in the US. And it's oftentimes not taking into account the situation on the ground, right? So these are the things. Why are you telling African people to become Europeans as opposed to thinking about policies that work for Africa? We have so much sunshine. Why are we not harnessing solar energy? So any type of advice should be based on what's our situation, right? If you're living in London, where I've been to London several times, I've never seen the sunshine. I haven't lived there over a long period of time. Anytime I'm passing through, it's cloudy. I said, this is a place everyone is running to come to, right? So if London is coming up with your development policies, they're not going to mention your economy and energy should be based on the sun. But that's something that would work based on where we are. We can go outside and see that this is something that could be effective in our situation. So these are things that we have to think about of how to resolve our own issues and our own problems, and think about our situation, right? If we have water bodies, how can we harness those? If we have solar, let's harness those. If we're on the ocean, then this is another form of energy, right? There are turbines that use deep sea movement in order to power the turbines, and then this comes back. And one of the byproducts of that is fresh water, right? They're using this in different places in the Caribbean right now. So if we're here in Ghana, why can't we start thinking like that? But instead of doing that, they don't recommend anything like that. They say privatize ECG, which means sell it to my own brother so that he can get rich, sell it for pennies on the dollar, and then he will get rich off of this. So they're giving you advice not to benefit you, but to benefit them, right? Ghana Telecom, they will do something, they'll say, all right, you're not doing it right, sell it to Vodafone, that's my cousin, right? Privatize everything, anything you own, sell it off to my cousins and brothers and sisters so they get richer, right? So we have to start thinking about, when we're talking about developing, we may have to come up with our own solutions, because those who may be giving us advice, they may be giving you advice that only helps them. And you can listen to like some like Anansi stories, where Anansi is a trickster. He would say, oh, come and lay down in this basket. Yeah, stick all of your legs through it, and then he ties you up. Aha! He was giving you advice, but the advice wasn't meant to help you. It was meant to help Anansi, and then you end up in the cooking pot. You don't know why. That's the situation we're in right now. We're in the cooking pot and we don't understand why. Right? But we continue. Also, doomsday narratives. There's a crisis of overpopulation in Africa, poverty, drought, overutilization of scarce resources, environmental crises, corruption, ethnic tensions, civil wars, all of which are resulting in a terrible crisis that requires external interventions to halt. That means the same people who create all these problems, now they have to come in and solve your problems for you. Right? And then we say, but hold on, you did this when you cut down all our forests. So we were looking at a documentary called Taking Roots about Wangari Maathai in Kenya. And she was known as a Nobel Prize laureate because she was able to plant so many of these trees. But when they were going into the beginning, the background, who destroyed all the trees in the first place? The British burned and cut down all of these forests so they could plant tea crops. Now you have a monocrop economy, you're dependent on tea for everything, but now you're not able to plant anything to help yourself. So the point is, why does she need to plant all these trees if someone didn't come and destroy all of your trees in the first place? So now they'll come in and say, oh look, you don't have trees, now we're going to come and help you. So now go plant cocoa for us. Now go plant this for us. But it's like you haven't resolved our issue that you created. So they say they will create disease, then they rent you a cure for the symptoms. Right? They're not trying to uproot the cause because they oftentimes are the cause. But then they will say, don't worry about that, we'll help you. But the things that they're saying will help you end up helping them. I think I mentioned this in the documentary called The Great African Scandal. Did I mention that in this class? We may show it on Thursday evenings. We have film showings at African Studies. We may show this. It's a documentary. And it talks about Ghana and how IMF and World Bank policies have intentionally destroyed Ghana in 3 specific industries. One is the rice industry. How many people are aware that rice is indigenous to Africa? Rice comes from Africa. How many people know that? 1.5. 2, okay. This one I wasn't sure to count or not to count. That, and we'll also go into this, it's called Orange La Berryman, and it was right here in Africa that they domesticated this crop. So it's also the staple food still up in the north, all the way over to places like Senegal where it's a national food. So if you ever talk about jollof rice, right, you're talking about the Wolof speakers. Their kingdom was called Jollof, and their language was called Wolof, and they still speak Wolof. It's a predominant language, like Akan is one of the major languages here. Wolof is one of the major languages there. So if you're calling Jollof rice, it's like saying Pantikinki. It's like saying, Ghana or anything else. You're mentioning it's like saying Bambara beans. The Bambara people are up in Mali. So you're saying the name of the people, they're saying whose food it is, right? So these are things that people say, oh, well, rice comes from China. They have a different type of rice called Oryza sativa that was domesticated separately there. But we domesticated this one hundreds of years ago, independent of anyone, and it's still the major staple. Now the things that we eat now, that we think are staples, actually many of them don't even come from Africa. I think we mentioned this, right? So the things that do come from here, we think are foreign. The things that don't come from here, we think are indigenous. This is what happens when we don't know our own history, right? We say it's rice, I have to eat it with knife and fork. But if you go to Senegal, they eat it with their hands, just like any other indigenous African food. So these are things that we should be thinking about. So yeah, the Great African Scandal. So it talks about how they destroyed the rice industry by giving imports, subsidized imports of white rice, oftentimes coming from America and other places. So in doing that, they were able to destroy the indigenous rice industry to the point where you're dependent now on imports of rice. You could grow your own brown rice, the red rice, you can grow it here, but now they've created a taste and a desire for this white rice, right? And now, even when they raise the price and remove the subsidies, they've already destroyed your industry, so you can't say, oh, let me go back to what I was doing before. You've already collapsed that one, right, by flooding the market with this cheaper subsidized white rice that has little to no nutritional value, whereas your own indigenous rice has plenty of nutrition inside of it, right? So these are the things that we have to be thinking about. So it talks about rice, it talks about the gold industry, right, and the destruction of the environment and how all of this is tied to IMF and World Bank policies, also these multinationals, such as AngloGold Ashanti, Newmont, so forth and so on. It ties all of these things, so when you see the Proud River that used to be considered sacred, if you look at it now, it looks like a gutter. Right? All of these rivers that used to be sacred, all of these lagoons and water bodies where you could go and drink it. Try and drink it now. So at the time where they told you, oh, you weren't civilized, you were able to take care of your environment and things were kept pristine because you knew I'm doing this for my descendants. But now everyone is so-called civilized and you've destroyed everything. One generation from now, we don't know what they will drink. So these are things, so it talks about that one. Then third, it talks about cocoa and the role of IMF and World Bank again in terms of child labor. A little bit of cocoa. A lot of the chocolate is due to child labor policies that were implemented intentionally by IMF and World Bank policies. So you can find it online, but again, I'll see if we can make that part of the lineup for this semester in African Studies, and I'll announce it, of course, here. So all of those were sidebars, but anyway, the idea, again, is that the solution has to come from outside, since African states are not competent to solve problems that they have created. So these are some of the narratives that they ram into your head. So once you say, I can't solve it myself, now let me go to the same ones who created the problem. And the solutions that they give you are oftentimes not solutions that are designed to help you, but rather to help them economically and in various other areas, right? Now these are things that we don't see often in terms of the USA, that there's plenty of homelessness, people sleeping on the streets, having to go to soup kitchens in Europe because they can't afford to feed themselves. Is anyone here homeless? Right? Is anyone here not able to feed themselves? Right? So, but that's not the predominant image that you think of when you think about Europe and the USA, but it's plenty. After the housing crisis in the late 2000s, so many places like Detroit, you could go blocks and blocks and all the houses are shut down. They talk about when the housing bubble burst. So lots of those people were left homeless. And even before this is an endemic problem, unemployment, but that's not the first thing you think of when you think of the USA, right? They have the propaganda to tell you that there's money falling from trees. The streets are paved with gold. If you just get there magically, you just pick up diamonds and say, look, I'm rich. And you pick up champagne like you are picking up your water here, right? That's the narrative that they tell you to make you think that this is the most wonderful thing ever. So now you should not use all your skills that you get to university here to develop Africa. You should go there and help them develop again, right? So this is an intentional image that keeps getting bombarded into your head, right? So what you have is an upward spiral for them, that whatever development they have, you go and contribute more to their development. Whatever underdevelopment we would have here, instead of helping to develop here, you say, oh, that place is magical, let me go and put more doctors there than we have in my own country, right? But then this is the image we have of starving, of deprivation. Now when people see that, they say that's here in Ghana. There was an attack in Kenya a few years ago at the mall, Westgate Mall, and people were calling my wife and saying, "Are you okay?" Right? They don't realize that Kenya is not Ghana. They say if it's Africa, all of Africa is that. You understand? It would be like, oh, someone got killed in Brazil, and I call up my friend in New York, "Are you okay?" I know that the Americas, North and South America, I know that there was something that happened there. And this is the same thing that happened with Ebola. So Ebola was not this huge thing here in Ghana. But people say, oh, I can't come to Ghana because Ebola is there. So then when they had the Zika virus down in South America, I called my friend back. And I said, oh, I know you're at Mississippi. How are you doing? I hope you're all right. Because there's a Zika virus going on there. Right? So the way that they blanket cover all of Africa with these narratives, imagine if we did the same thing and blanket cover all of the Americas with whatever's going on in any country there. Right? So again, it's not that those things don't happen, but we're asking for balance. If that's what's going on there, then why aren't you showing what's going on at University of Ghana? Why aren't you showing what's going on at our Independence Day and these other things, these great things that we're doing? Why? We're not even asking for more. To say, let's at least bring it up to somewhere close so that we can get a clear, holistic picture of Africa. And then on that side, let's bring up this one, because we don't know anything about all of the homelessness and poverty and shootings and suicides. All these people, they're supposed to be so rich, but they're committing suicide at higher rates than any people. This is in Europe and in the US. So what's going on? How come you're not giving us a balanced picture on that side? Right? So we don't want anyone to be dishonest. We're just saying, show us the complete thing, and then let us make our judgments based on the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We continue. Then they talk about bad governance. This guy was known in Italy and in Europe as a whole as someone who was one of the most corrupt officials ever. Right? Silvio Berlusconi, but this isn't what we think of when we first think of Europe. Right? We don't think about the Washington lobbyists who go in for their industry and they get people to change their votes on all these things. Right? They just pay you $1 million and now you say, okay, vote yes from no. So corrupt, but that's not the predominant thing that we think of. This guy, Slobodan Milosevic, was known for committing genocide. Right? So when you're talking about Serbia, Croatia, all of these places where there was a mass genocide, but that's not the first thing we think of when we think of Europe. This is intentional. But then when we think about here, they say, oh, Kwame Nkrumah wasn't good, Idi Amin isn't good, Nelson Mandela, okay, he was a bit okay. You have one good president, Mandela, he's gone. Now you're finished. Right? But then we had someone like Thomas Sankara, who was the poorest president in the entire earth when he was president. So they talk about people who are corrupt. He was known as the upright man, the uncorruptible man. So even after he was deposed in a coup that was financed by France, because they didn't want his revolutionary ideas to spread to other countries in West Africa, right? You can actually look at the documentary that goes into all of the information on this called The Upright Man. So even after his enemies who had done the coup, they wanted to see, no, we'll have to prove that he was corrupt, and then everyone will say it was okay. When they did the investigation to try to do that, they saw all he had was a broken refrigerator, 1 or 2 bicycles, and a guitar. The least corrupt president ever on the face of the earth. He would ride his bicycle into work. Right? So we had presidents who weren't corrupt. What did you do with them? Right? So if we're talking about corruption, let's talk about the ones who are uncorruptible and get a balanced picture of these things. Right? As Thomas Sankara, in case anyone is interested. When we talk about conflicts, again, we think about Africa, but again, we were talking about blown-up buildings from the genocide that went on there. And then even in Africa, we don't hear about the foreign mercenaries that are coming from places like Australia, like the US, like other places. So they come in. You may wonder, okay, Boko Haram, they have all these guns, but there's no gun factory in the bush in northeastern Nigeria. So who are the gun runners who are bringing them these guns? So we talk about these things, but we never think logically about them, right? There's a documentary called The Diamond Life. You can tell I'm into documentaries. So we hear about Charles Taylor and these other ones, but we don't talk about the ones who funded them, such as the Beers and many of these multinational diamond cartels. So you would say, well, how are they getting all of these guns and advanced weaponry? Because they're not manufacturing in there in Liberia, Sierra Leone. But you find out if you follow the money trail, you see who benefits from the same thing in Eastern Congo. If any of you have cell phones, does anyone here have a cell phone? I say, anyone? I'll show of hands. I'll show of hands. I see you sitting there with it and you don't want to raise it. That in Eastern Congo, there have been multiple millions of Africans who have been killed for what's called coltan. And again, you have corporations like Halliburton who go in and they fund these rebel groups so they can get all of this coltan out without paying any market price, without having to pay tax and deal with any international agreements. They say, oh, if you're unhappy in your country, we'll give you guns. You give us coltan. Same thing in Sierra Leone, they have this movie, this one is a documentary called Blood Diamonds, but there are plenty of documentaries such as this one that go into the facts of the situation. So when they're talking about blood diamonds, they're talking about these huge diamond cartels who go in and fund people. It's like, let's say NDC and NPP, let's say NPP is in power. So you say, oh, I think the NDC people may not be happy. So let's go to them and tell them, oh, we'll give you these things. Just give us diamonds. We'll give you anything that you need. Any weaponry you need, we'll funnel it to you. So that's what they're talking about when they're saying blood diamonds. Because the rebel groups, now they run havoc all throughout the countryside, cutting off arms, doing all these things. But they're funded in their entire existence is from these diamond cartels. So instead of paying the billions that they would have to pay for the diamonds, they say, I give you a gun, you give me 20 diamonds. It's not a fair exchange. But it's not supposed to be either. So these are the things that we don't hear about, but all of this is documented, and I say that you should follow up on this information. If it's not something that you already know, follow up and research. Right? We continue. So again, there are debates about cultural practices, ritual killing, circumcision, widowhood rites, libation, child marriage, child labor, bride wealth, witchcraft. Now let's talk about ritual killings. You may have heard of what's called Black Lives Matter. Has anyone heard of that? This is about all of the black people who are being shot down by the police and by even white civilians in places like the U.S. But it's not limited to the U.S. This goes on all throughout the world, right? So when we look at this, we find Africans who are being killed every day in Chicago. We mentioned some of their names: Laquan McDonald, Mike Brown, all of these Oscar Grant, Sean Bell. These are Africans who are being shot. Sometimes it's continental Africans who are shot by the police. So a famous case was Amadou Diallo. He was going into his own apartment. They said, stop. And then they shot him over 41 times. He was just going into his own apartment. He turns around, all these plainclothes officers who had not identified themselves, they shot him all of these times. Right? So when we're talking about ritual killings, this is what we need to be talking about. African people who are being shot down in the streets, hung even to this day. But how come this isn't what we hear about? Again, we're not saying say anything false. Let's get a balance so we understand what is actually going on in the world. Right? Circumcision, widowhood rights. So the question now becomes, what is African? Is anything that we happen to see continental Africans doing automatically African? Now, we gave the example before. We were talking about libation, for example. So at the independence, we saw the guy William, who was pouring libation with schnapps, 2 bottles of schnapps. So pouring libation in and of itself seems African, but he's getting schnapps from where? Holland or someplace. Right? So we have to even ask ourselves, how African is this African thing that you're doing? Who benefits economically every single time you have to pour out 2 bottles? You have to go to Holland and bring it. Right? So they're laughing all the way to the bank as they say, yes, you're doing your culture, but you're enriching us. Right? So what I'm getting at is we have to think critically about all of these things. All these things that we think are African, actually African, from the food to the liquor to the whatever. And think about who benefits from it. Economically especially, but in every area, psychologically. Right? If I'm from the USA and I see you wearing all your clothes coming from the USA, I know I benefited economically, I also benefit psychologically. You people can't even clothe your own selves. You have to come to me with Ombroni Wehu. I don't know if you know what that is. Right? That's what they call the white man has died. So that's a psychological boost for me as well. Because you're ashamed to wear things that would benefit your own people. So then you have to ask yourself, who taught you to be ashamed and why? Did they know that they would give billions and billions of dollars just because you are ashamed of wearing things that are produced by your own people? So therefore they pump it into movies that this is what's good, onto TV, this is what's good. And then you think you're making a decision, but you've been manipulated by all the advertisements and all the movies, all the TV shows. So again, what we're getting at is think critically. Don't just accept what you see on TV and say, oh, I just want shoes just like I saw there. What made you want it? Who benefits from you wanting it? So there's a psychologist, I think I mentioned him last week, Amos Wilson, who is now passed on, but he still has lectures that you can look at online, where he asks the question, how come everything that black people just happen to want to do just also happens to enrich Europeans? Right? So if we're talking about clothes again, how come everything you just happen to want to wear is something that will put millions and millions of dollars in the hands of these other people and not millions into your own economy? You say, oh, how come our economy isn't doing well? Take responsibility and say, what have I done in order to make my economy be like that? It's not like pointing the fingers. Think about what am I doing to be complicit in my own demise. Right? So we continue. Has anyone seen this before?
Yes.
Where have you seen it? Akwafu. Good. Where else? Inside a book. Inside a book. Okay. Very good. That's what I was looking for. It's part of the university's logo. Is anyone a student here at University of Ghana? If you don't recognize this, I should take you up to the Vice Chancellor right now. He said, look, he's your student. This is called Jini Nimang. Jini Nimang, let's say it together. Jini Nimang. Jini Nimang. And this is the ram's horns. Has anyone ever heard the word Ojang before? Ojang, that's a sheep. But when you want to say a male version, you add nini to it. So akoko is chicken, akukonini is now a male version of that. So that's a rooster or a cock. So Janini is coming from Ojang, nini, which is a male sheep, and then men is horns. And there's a proverb in P. Does anyone want to try to say that for me? Who's brave? Very good, that's bravery. So Janini, so repeat after me, Janini. Yeah. It's Isia. Ode. na koma, na enye, ni man. So it's saying if a ram is going to bully you, it uses its heart and not its horns. So it means it's not necessarily your physical strength. Sometimes it's based on your willpower, right? Very good. So again, these are things that we could think about. Not only do we have full writing systems, we also had ideograms, things that have entire proverbs, entire lessons inside them on ethics and more. But now we see it and we say, oh, look at a pretty design. But we're not getting the fullness of what it's telling you that your ancestors have preserved it for you to learn. Right? You continue. So contemporary Africa has contributed positively to global knowledge, production, and civilization in areas of agriculture, academia, international trade and commerce. We can also talk about, we mentioned mathematics, we mentioned science, we mentioned all these inventions, so forth and so on. This is what we'll go into. And this one, for the sake of time, we'll go past it, but coffee is an African tree crop, originates in Ethiopia. So you think about coffee, many people think about the West, Starbucks and whatever, but this is something that's indigenous to Africa, right? Introduced into the Dutch colonies in Java in the 1690s, and then in the 1720s it was brought to the Americas, so forth and so on. So now Brazil is the major producer. Now cocoa is not indigenous to here. I think we all know that story to the question, right? So we think about coffee as being from there, but it's actually from here. Then we may think, oh, cocoa, that's Ghana, that's Cote d'Ivoire, but that one is actually not from here, right? Now, positive representation of Africa, we have people like Wole Soyinka, who was a Nobel Prize winner for literature in 1986, right? So when they're talking about Africa, how come they're not talking about the Nobel Prize winners, and we have many? Right? What they tell you about is your leader is corrupt, and that's it. Okay, if he's corrupt, let me know about the one who wasn't corrupt. Let's get balance. I'm not even saying don't tell us about this. We need to know about this just to resolve that problem. But we also have to know about positive examples and say, then let's not follow that one, let's follow this one. But what if you're not ever told that this one even exists and you say, oh, well, this is naturally corrupt. It's always been that way. We can't do anything. Oh, let me just chop what I can chop. Right? And think about who benefits from that type of mentality. Then you would understand how come they only told you about this one and didn't tell you about that one. If you remember our quote, that what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. What you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. So if you start to understand why you haven't been told all of those things, then you'll understand the chain that gets you to the actions that you see now. So if you say you don't like those actions, you better start learning from this side, and then you'll start doing better, because you know that you've done better in the past. So here we're coming to positive representation in terms of inventors. So we're talking about now the ones right here, the cats that are born and wherever cats are naturally born. So this is Prosper Mbok, who was the discoverer of the HIV-2 virus, Dr. Obiombo Obaje out of Nigeria, who pioneered the blood auto-transfusion, Samuel Todo out of Togo, the humanoid robot, Jean-Patrice Keka from our Democratic Republic of Congo, pioneered space rockets, Prof. Francis K. Alote out of Ghana. Has anyone ever heard of Ghana? We can find that one on the map. Very good. The Alote formalism, a very renowned mathematician, if you're not aware. Victor Johnson Obasa, the armored vehicle coming out of Nigeria. Simon Mwara out of Kenya, multi-purpose mobile remote control. Prof. Nina Kukweno out of Ghana, one of the pioneers in designing and developing the internet. Abdoulaye Touré out of Senegal, the solar oven. Philippe Yoda out of Burkina Faso, plastic recycling. And we can go on for days and days and days and days. Now, how many of these names have you heard of before? Professor Alote. Keep going. Who can add to the list? Now imagine this. All of you are in university. You want to go far in university. Let's imagine that you go so far that you become the inventor of this amazing thing, a flying car. Right? You get the patent for it, you design everything. But imagine all the students who come out after you never learn about you. You spent your entire life, you dedicated it to inventing all of these great things. But all the children who come up, they say, oh, African people can't invent anything. Only the white people can invent it. Only the Chinese can invent something. Right? So all of your life's work, they don't inspire anyone because you never learned the names of these people who have dedicated their lives. Would you like that if that happened to you? So you should ask yourself, how come this isn't part of your curriculum? Think of the inspiration you could get if you know that you did all these things in math and sciences and humanities in every area. Right? That you won Nobel Prizes in literature, you've done this, you've done that. Right? Would you be happy if you dedicated your whole life, changed the world, and no one who looks like you ever heard your name? You wouldn't be happy. But you have to start thinking, how come I don't know these names? But I bet you've heard the names of whites who have invented things. Have you? To the point where I had someone who, of course, wasn't in university, but she said, oh, only white people have invented things. And I said, this is how I know that we have a problem of miseducation, diseducation, and anti-education. We may be in school, but there's a difference between schooling and education. Right? So now we come to Africans born in other places. Dr. Mark Dean, who we mentioned, the inventor of the personal computer. So anytime you're using a PC, you should say, thank you, black man, for inventing this for me. Has anyone ever used a PC before? Any type of laptop PC, right? You've used it. How many of you, when you opened up your laptop, you were thinking, this is invented by a black man who looks just like me? You think you would do better at computers if you know that someone who looked just like you is the one who invented it? That may be part of why you've never heard that name. But let's continue. Garrett A. Morgan, the traffic light, the gas mask. Jan Ernst Matzlinger, the shoe lasting machine. Elijah McCoy, oil cup railway lubrication devices, many of them. Granville T. Woods, the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph. This is one of the forerunners to what we know as a telephone. Louis Latimer, the incandescent lamp, carbon filaments. So he was a very important inventor. So when you think about the lights, when you turn on the lights, you should be thinking, thank you, Louis Latimer, for giving us light. Right? But we don't hear these names. He was a contemporary of the other ones who you may have heard of. So Thomas Edison. So he was working with Thomas Edison. And he was able to even get the patent on what he did that made it a practical solution to have electric lamps. Right? But we don't hear the names of the Africans who oftentimes were the ones who came up with the ideas in the first place. Daniel Hale Williams, open heart surgery. How many people knew that open heart surgery was first done by a black person? An African living abroad? You never heard that. Look it up, put this in your notes, and then go and check it out. Open heart surgery. You should have all of this in your notes so you can go and verify. Right? But then we say, oh, medicine, we can't do it, even though we invented medicine. Right? So not only were you doing great things in ancient times, you've been doing great things in modern times as well. But how come this isn't part of your curriculum? Is anyone here pre-med? No? I was going to ask how many, well let's still ask it, how many think that people would do better at pre-med if they knew that they invented medicine, that their ancestors invented medicine? I think so. Very good. Also, Dr. Charles Drew invented blood transfusions, right? And his story is a very tragic story because he invented blood transfusions and then he got into a car accident. And because at that time you had whites-only hospitals and blacks-only hospitals, he got into a car crash and he was losing blood. And the closest hospital was a whites-only hospital. They said, we won't treat you, black man. So on his way to the black-only hospital, he died. and he invented the procedure that could have saved his life. Right? But this is what we were dealing with as African people, and we still deal with this to this day. George Washington Carver, plant-based inventions, mainly around the peanut, inventing many things such as windshields, plastics, all these things using plant-based fibers and inventions, right? Benjamin Banneker invented the grandfather clock, the almanac, and also Washington, D.C. He was the one who laid out the capital of Washington, D.C. The White House was also built by African people. The capital of the United States was also built by African people, right? So all these things you see, oh, wonderful things, we don't think that these are African people who did the entire thing. The layout of the entire city was made by Benjamin Banneker. And he laid it out to be just like a replica of Kemet. I hope everyone knows what Kemet is, right? So he laid it out the same way that cities in Kemet were laid out, right? Just so you would know as a black man who did it, I'm doing it just like my ancestors did it. Frederick M. Jones mobile refrigeration units. So if you have anything that stays cool, you have to thank an African for this. Now, how many of you have heard these names before? Good. Garrett A. Morgan and Louis Latimer. Very good. Anyone else? Now, where did you hear those names? Very good. George Washington Carver. Very good. Very good. Yeah. So these are things that you should grow up already knowing, right? You would be much more confident if you knew that your people had been pioneers in all these different areas. I'm not saying you're not confident, but oftentimes our confidence is like, oh, let me be like someone else. I'm confident that I can stop being African and be like someone else. I'm confident in that. But imagine if you are confident and say, I can be myself and do all the great things that my ancestors have been doing and my contemporaries are still doing to this day. So let's continue. So Prof. Monty Jones, this is coming back to rights. I hope everyone is okay. Right? Are you with me? Very good. So Prof. Monty Jones is a renowned plant breeder from Sierra Leone who in 2004 won the World Food Prize for leading a team at West Africa Rice Development Association, crossing West African rice, that's the one that's indigenous to here, indigenous West African rice, that's called Oryza glaberrima, with Asian rice, that's Oryza sativa, creating the Neraka varieties, a new rice for Africa, a rare and successful hybridization of rice. His approach is recognized to be innovative in its use of participatory methods linking farmers, extension agents, and scientists. So this is Prof. Monty Jones out of Sierra Leone. So he's doing all these great things using the indigenous rice, but we don't even know that rice comes from here. Right? So again, think about you've dedicated your whole life to do something that can change the life of so many people, and then we say, oh, look at the rice that's coming from China, wonderful. Right? Would you be happy about that? It's like you've wasted your whole life because you haven't inspired anyone. Not because what you have done isn't inspirational, but because your people have never heard your name. So we have a curriculum problem, is what we're seeing. Ethiopian Airlines, so we always hear about, oh, African companies can't do well, corruption, blah, blah, blah. But you have many successful commercial ventures, one of which is Ethiopian Airlines, established in 1945. It survived many crises that have plagued the airline industry and has grown to become one of the major airlines in the world, flying a wide range of routes the world over. So it has 10 787s and confident global ambitions, right? So when we're talking about companies in Africa, how come we don't hear about the successful indigenous ones? Again, we're not saying don't tell us about any of the other ones, but let's get some balance, right? So we can know this is the one to follow after, and those are the ones not to. Right? We're not saying say anything false. We're not saying omit anything. Just let us get some balance so we can at least hear about the ones that will help us do for ourselves. Right? So as we talk about African studies, it's a formally organized multidisciplinary academic study of the continent of Africa and the African diaspora. So it has three major dimensions. research and knowledge production. So going and finding all this information to provide it for you. That's one side. Dissemination of knowledge, that's now when we're providing it in various ways through videos, through books, through articles, and through teaching. Then applying the knowledge for the transformation of knowledge into policies and social action. So if we know that the schooling has not been doing us well, then we can say we need a different policy for education, right? We need to know some of these things from childhood. It shouldn't be, oh, I'm 19 and 20 years old, that's the first time I've heard anything about Africa, right? Meanwhile, you have people in the US and UK and everywhere else who study Africa, and when they come here, they will put you to shame, right? Because oftentimes we know the map of Europe more than we know the map of Africa. Because of La Liga, Bundesliga, Premier Liga, right? So we can tell you everything in Europe, but now we say, oh, tell me something about Africa. Then we start looking like this. I can point to Ghana. Oh, right? Well, oftentimes they study it because they know that whosoever controls Africa controls the world, right? If you want uranium for your nuclear weapons, if you want plutonium, that's Africa. If you want diamonds, which are not only to wear, but we're talking about the industrial uses of diamonds, of gold. We mentioned coltan. No cell phone would work without coltan coming out of Eastern Congo, right? There would be no cell phone boom or cell phone industry without the Congo, but the people there are suffering from genocide, again because of these multinational corporations like Halliburton, who contribute to deforestation, who contribute to these rebel groups and other things, right? The crisis in the Congo going all the way back to the time of Patrice Lumumba. So you should look up some of these things and you should know these things. Also, documentary and non-documentary sources such as archaeology. So this provides information on how humans adapted to their environment. So archaeological information is obtained through the excavation of specially selected sites. So examples such as the Ifat Bronze Works, the Zimbabwe ruins, the Pharaonic pyramids, and so forth and so on. Just today, I was looking at a news story that was talking about a new statue of Ramesses II was found. So Ramesses II is what they call him. In his time, he was known as Ramesu Uso Mahat Ra Ra. Right? So they found this statue, but this is what we're talking about when we're dealing with archaeology, right? So perhaps you wouldn't have known that he had done this, but when you go digging, excavating, that's where you can find out new information. Also linguistics. So for example, you can study the origin, structure, and changes of a language. Languages that are closely related, so Ga and Danwe, Wale, and Dagare may be deemed to have developed out of a single parent language. This is my major area of linguistics. So for example, in Chi you have boo to break off. Let's say it together. Boo. 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 Good. And then in Yoruba you have boo to break off. Right? And then in Bantu languages, we're talking about in Congo, all these areas, you have boom to break. Common Bantu, boo, boo, bim, boom to break. So if you find all these correlations in all these languages, you know that at some point in time they must trace back to a single parent language. So even though in this day you say, oh, they're so different, but you can find these commonalities, right? Because there's a monogenetic history of human beings. So at one point in time we were all together. And we can think about this in terms of words for kill, die, dance, walk. So we're talking about the basic vocabulary in any language we have, right? So not necessarily, I'm not sure, some type of very technical term, but something that's basic to everyone, like sun, the word for sun, right? So when you get to those basic vocabulary words, you can see, oh, it's the same in this language as it is in other languages that are related. Whereas something that's very distant or unrelated will have a completely different word for some of these things, unless there's contact and borrowing back and forth. So these are the things that we're looking at in linguistics. So a comparative study of languages can provide valuable historical information. So for example, a study of Bantu and West African languages may provide evidence of a common ancestor, just as we're showing you here. Right? So that's linguistics, specifically historical and comparative linguistics,